Hey, welcome to the Virtually Speaking podcast, continuing coverage of VMware Cloud Foundation 9.1. John, how you feeling?
I'm on the edge of my seat, Pete.
You're living on the edge? I knew it, John. I knew it. Yeah. For those listening at home, yeah, this guy is the king of segues. We are talking about edge, and we're not alone. We're talking to a good friend of ours, Mr. Rick Walsworth. Rick, welcome back to Virtually Speaking.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be back here, guys.
Very cool. So, Rick, 9.1 came out, and there's a lot of really great topics, but we want to talk to you about edge. Well, what do we need to know from the very top level, and then we'll start to drill down about what's new in edge, but more in general, like what is the problem statement?
Yeah. I mean, edge obviously has been around for a while, right? We've had many solutions. I mean, dating back to vSphere Robo, back to the early days of vSphere. And it's been one that we've been making investments in over the past couple of releases. But if you're looking at what are the problems we're solving, the first problem is really around how do I secure the edge, right? How do I make sure that I've got the right level of security that's out there? How do I scale these environments? Because when you're talking about edge deployments for retail and for some of these really bizarre use cases, you're not talking tens or hundreds of nodes. You're talking about thousands of remote edge devices that you're trying to bring in as part of that. And then as part of that, how do I deploy these quickly? So speed comes into the conversation. And then obviously, how do I make it simple? Because a lot of times I don't have technical personnel at the site. So how do I deploy these edge sites without having to roll trucks and put technical people out at each of these locations?
I remember dealing with some remote sites in the woods of West Virginia where a lumber camp. And it's okay,
Exactly.
we need in-crown to have because I'm going to have some random lumber mill operator unboxing these things.
Exactly.
You have remote hands. Yes, they are hands, but they are not necessarily data center class skilled hands.
Right.
So how do we make that work for them?
Yeah, it's the ability really to be able to essentially just ship a device that's out there, right? All you have to do is give it power and network, and then it does everything else after that. So that's really helping to address, I think, that simplicity and the scale question, allowing us to be able to do that. And we're introducing technology. We've introduced technology in 9.1 that actually does that very nicely, called zero-touch provisioning. And it does exactly as we say, right? We're using essentially elastic provisioning capabilities of vSphere to be able to provide an automated way to be able to stand up an edge location very easily without having to roll a truck.
And conveniently, we did it with 4 S's. And we're walking through the 4 S's there. I noticed that little trend there. So security, scale, speed, and simplicity. Yep. So why don't we sort of walk through each one of those, starting with the first one, security.
Well, security obviously is top of mind, when you're talking about data center deployments. But a lot of times you'll make concessions when you deploy out to the edge, right? Maybe I don't have the same level of security. Well, we are actually bringing that same level of security. The security capabilities we're delivering in 9.1, we're actually extending that out to the edge. So you think about confidential computing, you think about TPM support, you think about all the capabilities that we use to harden the data center core. We're actually doing the same thing out at the edge as well.
And that actually makes more sense because when you talk through some of these attack concerns, for confidential compute of, okay, someone's going to break into my data center and they're going to steal a DIMM, they're going to throw it in some liquid nitrogen quick enough that they can go take it to a machine to dump my encryption keys. This is some James Bond stuff. Right. Exactly. The nice colos have at least a security guard who might be armed or something and some nice good locks, but these remote sites, there's sometimes a back closet with a door that an auditor said was a lock.
Right.
And so these capabilities, they kind of make more sense there. Some of the concerns about, secure boot and things like that, that chain of trust of firmware attacks, okay, who's really going to swap my NIC with a bad NIC? Well, at the edge, there's a bit more of an attack surface there.
Right, exactly. And especially when you start looking at some of the use cases and applications that edge is being used for, you think government, you think military, you think intelligence. The level of scrutiny from a security standpoint goes up quite a lot. And you're not only making sure that you're protecting that network edge, but also making sure you're looking within the network too. So we can actually deploy vDefend to be able to look for east-west transgressions if indeed something does break through. And we take advantage of our desired state configuration management so that I can essentially set a desired state, and then over time, if either due to network changes or the infrastructure changes, it actually does start to change, I can detect that drift. I look for config drift to be able to say, hey, this is a condition I might want to go pay attention to. I get it in my ops screen. I can actually go take corrective action remotely without ever having to roll a truck to that site.
Well, and some of the edge may have transitory networking because of the nature of it's powered off, or it's mobile, or it's a squirrel happened to eat the T1 cable.
It happens.
For some reason, it's always acorn flavored cable. And if you had an imperative push-based system of you push the patch, it either got or it didn't, who knows? But having that drift of, oh, this site came back online and now it's failing compliance, let's begin the remediation.
Exactly. So to be able to essentially see that coming and then take corrective action before it does become an issue. And then you have to consider too, especially for a lot of these use cases, you may be in a dark site. You may be disconnected from a network for 6 months, right? Like you said, if I'm deployed in a submarine or deployed out in a very remote location, I may not have the benefit of network connectivity.
And someone bridges the aircraft, brings that update file out, and they're just shove that in, and they're not necessarily, again, the most skilled data center operator, but it loads into the portal and it just goes.
Exactly. So
yeah. And so when we say edge, sometimes people think edge being like, oh, they've got a couple of remote offices out there. But unfortunately, edge usually means there's organizations that have many, 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 many edge points.
Exactly.
Which speaks to the second point, which is scale.
Scale, right. How do I scale out to thousands of remote sites and do so without having to roll a truck, so to speak, to every one of those sites as I do that? So you start to look at ways to be able to leverage that desired state configuration, right? So we use GitOps as a way to be able to essentially provide a desired state management for not only the initial configuration, but then also, as we talked about, the ability to manage configuration changes over time. But that's not enough, right? A lot of times these are, as John said, at very remote sites where I don't have the benefit of technical personnel that are at that site. So how can I provide an environment where I essentially just ship a piece of hardware, plug it in, give it power, connect it to the network, and then from that point, it does all of the provisioning as part of that. We call that zero-touch provisioning, and it's something we use to not only provide that scale, to be able to scale out to thousands of sites, but we also use it as a way to simplify those deployments. So I can have effectively a low-paid person at that remote site, so to speak, that doesn't have the technical skills to essentially, do the network connection, do the power connection, and essentially everything else is done by the system.
So yeah, if it's my oil rig or whatever that I'm flying someone out by helicopter, I don't have to send a sysadmin with him. And
right.
The same guy who's going to go turn some wrenches can also go deliver that package.
Yeah. But think about this too, is that this level of scale we're providing within VMware Cloud Foundation, within the core platform, we're actually now extending that out to the edge. So I can have almost double the number of hosts within a single VCF instance. I can scale that out to the edge as well. Within a VKS environment, I can scale out my VKS environment within the data center, but I can also do that, have that same level of scaling provided out across to a remote data center as well.
Well, and from scaling basis on the edge and being able to scale up those Kubernetes environments and things like that, and the core data center, you generally had someone who could turn that knob or do that or react to that, but having those auto scaling the edge where the workloads on the edge can be a lot more bursty and weird and unpredictable. You don't necessarily, and minor changes in that environment can significantly shift that resource load.
Yeah, and think about it when I start running AI out at the edge, and we are absolutely seeing a lot of use cases for AI running out at the edge, now that starts to bring that burstiness to a whole nother level.
All right, well, now I just need to go find some more CPUs.
Nice. Let's move on to the third one, which is speed. Now, when we talk about speed, are we talking about, performance, or are we talking about speed in terms of like deployment?
It's really more about deployment, right? What are the things that introduce friction when I'm deploying an edge, workloads out at the edge, right? So we try to look at how those friction points come in, and it's typically installation, configuration, but then once I do that, how do I manage lifecycle out across there? And so much like we do within a VCF environment, we can actually lifecycle all those edge locations at the same time. So it really reduces the amount of time it takes, day zero to stand up a net new environment. Day one, when I configure it, I can automate that, so I get automation there. But then the day two lifecycle management. So you think about it, right? Again, scenario, I have thousands of sites that I'm trying to update at the same time. How do I apply essentially an update through lifecycle management that gets applied to all those sites simultaneously when I know some of those sites may or may not have connectivity at that time? So it has to be able to accommodate for either bad network connections or no network connections.
Transient behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
And what's always interesting is talking to some of these customers who are like retailers, for instance, who have thousands of sites, or a pharmacy. I met like 2 guys who were managing 12,000 pharmacy locations. And if they're having to click ops through that, I mean, it basically is just a never-ending project that's going in a circle. And they're always perpetually going to end up with some hosts that are stuck on a 6.x, that's been time forgot. Like, you just end up behind.
Yep.
The scale of those projects, where if you're in a normal data center and you're just upgrading everything and let go.
Yep.
But if you're having to go through this is a huge difference of being able for people actually to not be in a perpetual state of being on 3 different versions because of your slow rotating refresh cycles.
Exactly. And I mean, the benefit that we get by essentially running the same code in the data centers we run out at those edge locations gives us that benefit too. So, I mean, you think about, some of the things we introduced with 9.1 is the ability to be able to essentially, rapidly deploy a VKS environment. So rather than having to essentially re-image the image from start, I can now just use the link clone technology as a way to be able to look at the deltas and only update the deltas. So that means my updates now happen 85% faster.
That is going to be a lot faster. And this is nice, especially on the edge with some of the other hardware improvements, extending support for Cascade Lake into the 9 branch, because people are struggling to get these edge projects done and deal with this life cycle. It's good to see holistically all the stuff we're doing to take care of.
And we didn't mention it, but the other thing you need to consider too is that especially for these devices where they're deploying new hardware, with a lot of the supply chain and memory issues that we're seeing right now, the ability to leverage NVMe as a memory tier so I can offload that applies even more at the edge, because I have a lot of cost sensitivity out at the edge. I don't want to have to deploy net new devices. So if I can get more life out of my existing hardware by leveraging memory tiering as a way to be able to lower that cost, it just gives me a lot more benefits there.
Well, and you may think of, okay, this isn't only $2,000 per server, but when you multiply 2,000 times 20,000, like those numbers, it was always weird where I would have these conversations like, why don't you just spend an extra $200 on the server on this NIC or this? And they're like, they start multiplying out how many sites. Oh, there's 40,000 locations. I'm like, oh, that is actually a real number.
And that's assuming you could get those devices. Right now, the supply chain issues are just killing you.
All right, so the last S is simplicity, and I think we touched on this a little bit, but it makes sense specifically at the edge because you don't have to pay for talent to be there for 20,000 sites.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so the ability to be able to take manual steps out of the process is huge, right? So it's a couple things. Zero touch provisioning, right? We talked about that before, where I can essentially just give it power, give it network, and then everything else happens by the system itself. Making sure that from a desired state standpoint that I can essentially maintain that configuration state even as systems change over time, and the ability to be able to essentially streamline deployment of net new workloads, right? So bringing in, we talked about VKS, bringing in AI out across there. How can I automate and streamline those so that essentially I can start to deploy those workloads out closer to where that data is being created out at the edge? Powerful stuff.
Yeah. So let's move on to the different use cases. I know there's a lot of them for Edge. Can you share just a couple of more popular use cases?
Well, certainly where we're seeing a lot of demand, a lot of traction is where you would expect it, right? Financial services, retail is a big one, logistics, energy. These are some of the the verticals that we're seeing these deployed. But what's interesting is that the use cases are changing, right? We're starting to get many more use cases now for, I've got a remote development team, I need them to be able to connect back to that main site. So now I want the ability to be able to deploy Kubernetes for modern applications out across there. AI at the edge. This is huge. And this is something we are anticipating to see a lot more demand for as we go forward, is the ability to be able to push that data processing as closer to the data source as we can. And it does a couple things. One is that you can actually do your data cleansing out at those edge locations and only send back that cleansed data. So it's going to essentially remove a lot of that processing from the network and from the core data center, because I'm actually able to do that much closer to the data edges.
I like that trying to filter the data is close, reduce the amount of data, and it's been backups, the amount that ends from the WAN. Yep. I mean, I always hear this analogy, data is like oil. I'm like, yeah, it's toxic, dangerous, and you really should be careful and try to minimize just throwing it all over the place. So, but it sounds like we're extending a lot of data management capabilities, and hopefully with DSM and other capabilities, we can extend that further. So.
And not only that, but I mean, if some of the use cases we talked about, right? Deployed in a submarine or sitting on a truck out across there where I have a satellite connection rather than a WAN connection. So we are starting to see a lot more, I'll just say kind of transient use cases. Not sure how mainstream they are, but we're trying to make sure that we've got a system that's robust enough to be able to support those.
Yeah, that makes sense. John, have you heard what Audi's doing on the edge? They did a full story about it, and there's a white paper about it. It's really exciting.
No, so this is actually something we've been working on for several years now. So it's called Edge Cloud for Production. So essentially what they did, if you think about the robotics that happen within a shop floor and a factory floor, yep. There's what they call programmable logic controllers, which are essentially industrial PCs that are built for a single purpose, right? Think about painting or assembling a door or assembling a trunk within
PLC controllers.
Yeah, these PLCs have single purpose, right? And they're all hardware based. And Audi found that to be very inefficient. Especially you think about maintaining all those physical hardware devices.
They're all like proprietary one-offs.
And so the first driver for this was to virtualize those. And so essentially what they call the software-defined factory now brings us to a point where now you can actually have software-defined instances out across there. But now what they've done is they've taken it to a whole nother level. They're taking all of these programmable logic controllers and all of the systems behind it. So this is a project we worked on with both Siemens and Cisco to be able to deliver a system end-to-end that supports this Edge Cloud for Production. We rolled it out in the first location, which was one of their smaller factories in Ingolstadt, which actually they build the e-tron GTs, which are awesome cars. So you've seen them as awesome vehicles, right, as part of it. But now what they're doing is now they've kind of used that as a test bed. They're now deploying that out on a global basis to all of their factories. So we're starting to see now deployments out across more and more of the factories. What's cool is that they do not want to hold the industry hostage. They're actually taking a very open approach, and we're working with an organization called ARC as a way to be able to essentially provide really more of a standardized approach for deploying these at scale across different manufacturing applications. Doesn't have to be automotive, can be across different applications. But they're using this methodology and this architecture as a way to be able to help not only provide awareness for the solution, but leverage this as a way to be able to find deployments like this that can take advantage of this type of technology.
This sounds kind of like the Open Compute project, but for manufacturing.
Right, exactly.
That's cool, and just trying to improve the outcomes of your industry that way. They'll benefit back from it, I'm sure.
Oh, and they already have. I mean, some of the metrics that they use in terms of looking at the maintenance of these devices, they've really kind of streamlined that and taken a lot of the manual maintenance out of it. Because before, when something failed, they would literally have to change the hardware from that, go and troubleshoot the hardware as part of it. Now everything's software defined, and they can actually bring that
back
telemetry
and hopefully predict better.
But the other benefit, which was interesting, is they've actually been able to speed up production because of the fact that they're more efficient and the handoffs between sites are actually happening now. They've been able to increase the production velocity of how many vehicles they can get through there. So that actually can be measured back into that. So they're seeing, it's a great project.
Faster cars ship faster.
Faster cars ship faster.
I love it. I mean, that is a brilliant idea to take what was such a, dated, static, factory thing, single purpose machine to actually make that software defined. That was a brilliant move. I love that. I love that VCF is inside of that story. That's just one example of a pretty cool use case inside of Edge.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Rick, thank you so much for joining us on Virtually Speaking. This has been just yet another cool episode on VCF 9.1. And for those of you listening to this, go ahead and jump on over to the YouTube channel. We're at VMware Cloud Foundation. You can catch the entire series in addition to all of our other podcasts. Thanks for joining. And Rick, thanks so much for joining us, my friend.
Appreciate it. Thanks.